I want to start with a number that should get your attention immediately. This fall, we could be looking at one of the strongest El Niño events ever recorded heading into the season, potentially the strongest on record. And here's the thing about historically strong El Niño falls that catches people off guard every single time. They are surprisingly stormy, and for parts of the country you would never expect, surprisingly cold. Today we're rolling out our full official fall forecast for 2026. Precipitation, temperature, region by region, snow outlook, everything. And if you want a custom breakdown for exactly where you live, drop your location in the comments, like this video, and subscribe, and I'll make sure you get it. Let's dive into the data. Let's start with precipitation, because this is where the record strength El Niño signal shows up most clearly and where our confidence levels really tell the story. Here's how we build a forecast like this. We don't just throw a dart at a model run. We go back through the history of comparable strong El Niño years and look at what actually happened. Then we lay that history on top of what the current model guidance is showing us. When the two agree strongly, our confidence goes way up. When they diverge, we show you that uncertainty honestly instead of pretending we know something we don't. At the broadest level, above-average precipitation looks likely across nearly the entire southern tier of the country and stretching up the east coast. This is the classic El Niño signature, an active, stormy southern jet stream track that rides through the southwest, across the deep south, and then up the eastern seaboard in a nor'easter-style flow. Now, not every El Niño year plays out identically. In some years, that storm track stays suppressed farther south and never really makes it into the mid-Atlantic and northeast. In a smaller number of years, the track shifts and runs more through the inland states entirely. Those are the exceptions, not the rule, but they're real enough that we're not putting maximum confidence on the East Coast piece of this forecast. Where our confidence is at its absolute highest is the Southwest. Every single strong El Niño year we examined showed above-average precipitation in this region. 10 out of 10 agreement across the historical record and the model guidance. When you get that level of consensus, you put it in the top confidence tier, no hedging necessary. If you're in Arizona, New Mexico, or Southern California, plan on a wet fall. Now flip to the other side of the country, because El Niño years are just as famous for suppressing the northern storm track as they are for activating the southern one. The Northwest, the north-central states, and a good chunk of the Midwest and Great Lakes are looking at below-average precipitation this fall, and historically, that dry signal has a tendency to bleed into the winter months as well. So keep that in the back of your mind as we move toward December. Our confidence here builds from the Northwest through the Midwest at a medium level, with one final layer of near certainty specifically for the Pacific Northwest. Washington and Oregon in particular have essentially no historical exceptions in strong El Niño years. Dry falls are about as close to guaranteed as seasonal forecasting gets. There was one year in our analysis where the northern plains and upper Midwest came in closer to normal rather than dry, which is why that specific corridor carries slightly less certainty than the Pacific Northwest itself. Now let's move to temperatures. And this is where the forecast gets genuinely interesting, because recent trends and the deep historical record are actually pulling in different directions, and we're siding with recent trends for a specific reason. The West is going to run warm this fall. This comes down to a persistent ridge of high pressure that has dominated the region for months now, with zero signal in the model guidance that it's going to break down anytime soon. Here's the historical wrinkle worth mentioning. If you go back through the broader historical record of El Niño years, a lot of them actually showed cooler falls in the West. But recent trends, and we're talking about a ridge pattern that hasn't meaningfully broken in roughly 2 years, carry more weight than distant historical analogs when the current data is this consistent. With water temperatures running warm across the North Pacific feeding directly into this pattern, we expect that ridge to persist through fall and likely into winter as well. Our confidence on above-average temperatures for the Northwest sits at our highest tier for exactly this reason. There's an important exception carved out of that western warmth though, the Southwest. Southern California, southern Arizona, and southern New Mexico lean slightly below normal on temperature despite sitting under that same general ridge. Why the difference? Precipitation. When you get the above-average rain and cloud cover we just talked about, you get dynamic cooling, more clouds, more rain, cooler day-to-day conditions that drag the seasonal average down even while the broader region sits under high pressure. It's a subtle effect, but over a full rainy season it adds up. Moving east, we start to see genuine, traditional cooldowns rather than just cloud-driven cooling. When a ridge dominates the west this strongly, it typically gets displaced northward into Canada, which, even though you can't see it directly on a map, is exactly the mechanism that opens the door for Arctic air to periodically plunge into the eastern half of the country. These can be long-duration, consistent cool stretches, not just brief dips. One important caveat on how to read a seasonal outlook like this is not a promise of continuous cold from September 1st through the end of November. Seasonal forecasts describe the majority pattern, not every single day. Our read on the data and what the historical analogs support is something like this: a cooler, more fall-like September, a warmer ridge-driven October, and then a return to cooler conditions by November. Interestingly, a warmer October has historically been something of a leading indicator for a colder winter to follow, one of those quirky seasonal relationships that shows up often enough in the data to be worth mentioning. Our highest confidence for below-average fall temperature sits over the eastern Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, and stretching down through the Deep South into Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. This tracks with a pattern of Arctic air favoring a more eastward path that we've actually observed consistently over the past 12 months, which is also why the cold confidence doesn't extend as far west as you might otherwise expect. For the southern portion of that zone, the cooling comes from a combination of occasional Arctic intrusions later in the season, plus the same cloud and rain dynamic cooling effect we described for the southwest, layered on top of what should be a genuinely active storm track through the region. The single area where we have the most confidence in a colder than normal fall is the northeast corner of the country, the Ohio Valley, Mid-Atlantic, and Northeast specifically. Across the historical El Niño analog years we studied, this corner of the country came in colder with striking consistency. That's not a marginal lean. That's one of the strongest historical signals in this entire forecast. Now let's go region by region and paint the full picture of what fall 2026 actually looks and feels like depending on where you live. The Northwest is looking at a milder fall overall, a ridge holding firm overhead, drier conditions than typical, and honestly, a fall that's going to feel like an extension of summer well into the early part of the season. If you're in Washington or Oregon, don't put the shorts away too early this year. The Southwest tells the opposite story, stormy and cooler than normal. We built the case for this throughout the forecast. The highest confidence wet signal in the entire outlook paired with cloud-driven cooling that keeps temperatures below typical fall averages across Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California. For fall snowfall in the mountains, the picture actually splits depending on which section of the Rockies you're talking about. The northern Rockies, think Montana, Wyoming's higher elevations, line up with below-average snow, consistent with the below-average precipitation and above-average temperatures dominating that zone. But the southern Rockies, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and parts of Arizona are looking at an above-average snowfall season this fall. Same mountain range, two very different outcomes depending on latitude, and that's a direct reflection of where the wet and dry precipitation zones split. The north-central states, Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas, into Nebraska, see a less stormy, somewhat drier fall overall, with temperatures that could genuinely swing between warmer and cooler stretches rather than settling into one consistent lean. This is a region where the pattern doesn't commit strongly in either direction. For the south-central states, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas expect a stormier, cooler fall than typical, though not quite as consistently stormy as the Southwest. The temperature lean here should run a bit cooler than what the Southwest itself experiences, even with similar overall wetness. Two different flavors of the same general pattern. The upper Midwest, Great Lakes, and Ohio Valley are where the big cold shots concentrate, particularly as fall progresses. September in this region should still feel like a fairly typical September cooldown, 60s and 70s rather than anything extreme. But by November, some genuinely frigid air is on the table. The seasonal deviation from normal stays roughly consistent across the season even as the actual numbers on the thermometer drop lower later in fall. Worth remembering so you're not caught off guard when a November cold snap feels far more intense than a September one, even though both represent a similar deviation from what's typical for their respective month. For the Gulf states and Southeast, the tropics are part of this story too. We expect below-average tropical activity this fall as a whole. Normally that would suggest a precipitation deficit, since a chunk of typical fall rainfall in this region often comes from tropical systems. But here's the twist. The active nor'easter-style storm track we're forecasting for the broader region appears to compensate for that shortfall almost completely when you look at the full September through November window. The below-average tropical signal is really concentrated in the August to September stretch specifically. By the time you average out the whole season, the storm track picks up the slack. Finally, the lighter cool zone stretching from the northern deep south up into the mid-Atlantic and northeast should see frequent cooldowns, not as sharp or as cold as what hits the Midwest and Great Lakes, but noticeably more frequent than a typical fall. Watch the higher terrain here too. The Catskills, the Adirondacks, the Green Mountains, the White Mountains, because with a nor'easter-heavy storm track and below-average temperatures working together, the odds favor an above-normal chance of early mountain snowfall, especially as we move through October and into November. That's the complete picture for fall 2026, a record-contending El Niño driving an active southern storm track soaked in above-average rain and snow, a suppressed and drier northern tier, a persistent western ridge keeping the west coast warm while the southwest stays cool and wet beneath its own cloud cover, and a northeast and Ohio Valley corridor carrying our strongest cold signal of the entire forecast. Drop your city or region in the comments, and I'll make sure you get a forecast tailored specifically to where you live. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.